Thank you. Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Housing and Communities Select Committee. I am Councillor Claire Simmons, Chair of the committee, and I will be chairing tonight's meeting. This event is being streamed live on YouTube, and members of the public and the media are welcome to watch the meeting remotely and listen to the discussions taking place. Now I would like to welcome all those in the Council Chamber at Kensington Town Hall and everyone watching on YouTube. Before we proceed with the meeting, I would ask members of the committee to please make sure your mobiles are on silent or switched off. And we will start with 72 seconds silence to remember those who lost their lives in the Grenfell tragedy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies for absence. Apologies have so far been received from Councillor Joanna Gardner. Have we received any further apologies for absence? No? Everyone else is here. Declarations of interest. Does any member have an interest to declare? So we have just the one remaining item, item 3 on the agenda, the housing revenue account budget. So if we begin, before we get to the budget proper, there's a matter I think we all agree that we would like to have settled this evening, which is about the timing of the budget scrutiny. So previously it was agreed that we would be scrutinising this in November, and unfortunately that wasn't able to happen. And as a result, that's why we're having this additional meeting here, which has created extra work for the scrutiny team and for the committee. I think if it's possible, if we can have some agreement here, commitment, guarantee, if you like, of how this is going to be done in future years, and hopefully we can bring the scrutiny of the housing revenue account budget into line with the other business areas.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes. So firstly, I was going to start by apologising for the lateness of this report, because I do understand you needed to see it earlier. Without going into too many excuses, because I don't want to do that, we didn't actually get the final agreement from the government that they were going to commit to doing the CPI plus 1% until, I believe, January the 4th. I mean, it was assumed, but as you know, last year they didn't do that. Last year we actually had to have a below inflation rent rise. So we've spoken about it long and hard with the directors. So apologies, and I definitely will endeavour to make sure, if we get the right information from the government on time, to do it. But again, being mindful that the rent settlement agreement, which has run from 2020 to 2024, is going to be expiring in 24-25. So the government might well decide to change how they come up with a rent settlement. But let's assume that it will stay the same, and then we could budget on that. But I don't know whether it's maybe worth having our scrutiny meeting slightly more in early December rather than late November, because that just gives us that little bit more leeway if that was something to look at, Chair.
Yeah, just a couple of points on that, and I echo the Chair's request that we do the entire budget in one go. Obviously, as you'll probably know, a lot of the other departments are also depending on settlements from HMG in various areas, and the adult social care is an example of that. And they produce a budget in November which has a few assumptions in it, and one could reasonably see a housing budget with some assumptions in it and a clear explanation about what you're waiting for and the known unknowns, as it were. That sort of my preference would be to see something which clearly sets out the known unknowns in a reasonable time frame, so we only have to have one meeting. However, if housing is an exception over all of the council's departments and it cannot be done as early as that, perhaps we just programme a meeting in January and we say that the HRA is always going to be done in January because X, Y and Z reason. I think my preference would be to go in the normal time frame though.
Yeah, and just to also add, I suppose, in kind of slight special circumstances about the HRA, because this year we had to look at significant rent rises because of the inflation figures. It is such a very difficult decision that we had to take as well. We didn't want to rush it. And we had to consult with the Tenants Consultative Committee, and so I'm not aware of the adult social care budget and what difficult decisions they have to make. I'm sure they have to make many difficult decisions, but that is one of the mitigating issues that may make the HRA be a little bit more difficult. We wouldn't want to just put a kind of a blanket rent increase without having really consulted with people and really looked at all the different options for what is difficult in a high inflationary environment. I mean, as I think, I'll get Dan and Doug to add here, but if it was an inflation environment of 1 or 2%, which we've been having for the previous years, then it's not quite so complicated.
Yeah, and I completely get what you're saying, Councillor Hammond, about the balance between kind of earliness and certainty, if you see what I mean. And I totally appreciate what you're saying about how you'd rather see something earlier, even if it had some uncertainty in it. And I think what I was going to suggest is that, because it seems to me that one of the things that didn't work well this year was that we found ourselves kind of scrambling to find a date at quite late notice. And at the very least, what we can do is work perhaps with colleagues in governance and scrutiny, kind of more or less now, to plot things out for how we want it to work next time, so that we've got a timetable that we're all working to, so that we're not in a rush. You're not, you know what's coming when, and it will just kind of work. We can then play it out in an orderly way. So if you're happy to agree for us to agree that as an action, then we can sit down with the team and plan that out for next year, but very much on the basis that you're not seeing it kind of less than a week before leadership team are considering it. Yeah.
So are we saying that we're agreeing that next year we will be scrutinising this in January?
Early Jan or...
Is that what we're saying?
John? So just to be clear, I know that Archer and Doug and the team were working on this over Christmas, and I met with them on January the 3rd. So if for next year that can all be done a lot earlier, that's the question, I guess, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, whatever comes out here is going to be a formal recommendation, and based on what we've experienced this year, it was agreed with the OSC that this would be scrutinised in November. So if that was never going to be possible, it would have been really handy to know that in advance. And then when we inquire why it can't be done in November, the answer comes, well, it's never done in November, it's always January. So I hope you can all see why I personally am a little bit confused, and I don't want us to end this meeting without pretty much a cast iron understanding and agreement between us, whatever we end up deciding on, that I do not want in the following year to be then told just before it's supposed to be scrutinised that it can't be done. Oh,
Yeah.
so
No, Doug's desperately trying to say something. But perhaps the action might be that the scrutiny officers liaise with housing and to come up with an agreed date now. Would that?
So,
that it is always, this is a question of timetabling. It's not, I know it's not a deliberate or it's just that scrutiny has to be factored in, it has to be thought about, it's got to be planned and not just as an afterthought. So whether it's December, I would prefer early December if you can't do November, rather than January is really pushing it. But I mean, I do understand, but I think that what's happened is that you've got to think scrutiny, when is the scrutiny happening? And that's really what it is. So, I mean, I would be happy with early December as a time.
And of course, to Councillor Hammond's point, something that we brought at the end of the year would have, as it were, a bit more of a work in progress flavour than what you're seeing today. But of course, there's a benefit to that, which is that the recommendations that you make as a result of it can have time to be considered and then folded into the final approach. So I think as long as you're prepared to accept something which is a bit more, as Councillor Hammond said, kind of assumptions based and work in progressy, then perhaps that gives you an opportunity to influence the final outcome a bit more than's been possible this year. So let's plan something with the team on that basis, which is in kind of November or early December at the latest, and then try that for next year, if that sounds okay.
I think what we will do is make a recommendation if the committee are all agreed when we would like it, and then we will take it to the scrutiny team and the officers and take it from there. What I really do want is it to be pretty much cast iron, because if there were things that happened this year after it was agreed to come in November, and there were things that happened subsequently, we weren't told of them. So I think it is about good communication as well between all teams. So as a committee, are we happy to agree sort of late November, December time?
Early December, I think, seems to be.
Early December. Does that work for you?
so the big unknown, of course, is we don't know what the rent policy will be next year or when that will be announced, but we can bring something on whatever date. I get exactly the sentiments from the committee, and we will make sure that we bring what we know at the time. The longer we leave it, as Dan said, the more information you get, but if we leave it too late, then you haven't got the chance to input. So I think early December would be as good as any time, Chair.
Thank you, and thank you for the input there. So we'll make a formal recommendation that this come to scrutiny for next year, early December. Thank you. So, moving on then to the actual budget.
Yes, the report. So, as I said, we do not take the decision to raise rents lightly, and as you'll see in the report, this is one of the aspects of the budget. There are obviously many other aspects which I'm sure you'll want to scrutinise us on, but the report talks about the raising of rents, and we understand the cost pressures that everyone is under. And as a result, we have thought very long and hard about this and about the different options available to us as a council, and also then about the different ways that we can support those that this rent rise will impact. And so one of the things that we are doing, we are putting in place £500,000 into our tenancy support fund, and this is an increase from the fund last year. And not every council is doing this. I think only very few are, but I think it's the right thing we can do to help our residents. And also, we're mindful that our tenants who receive housing benefit and universal credit, which is around about 2/3 of our tenants, will be protected to some extent because the welfare is going up by 6.7%. So we've done a lot of toing and froing on all of this. But also we have to be aware that our budget, our council budget, has also been under quite a few pressures, obviously namely inflation, which has not only caused significant cost rises to our major works and our repairs, which is absolutely fundamental to us providing good and decent homes for our residents, but also to the cost of borrowing money. And our capital works programme has swelled from £400 million to £600 million, which is really significant. And another pressure also that we are under in housing in particular, which is quite different from other areas of the council, is we've got a very new regulatory environment, which I know you're very familiar with 2 new acts of government, both of which we really do welcome, but it will add significant increased costs to how we manage all our work in the housing departments. And finally, we are mandated by law, obviously, to deliver a balanced budget. And so this is why we are recommending that we are raising our rents by the amount that government has allowed us to do, which is CPI plus 1%. So that brings that to 7.7%. And we're not alone in this. We have looked at all other London boroughs, which have also only announced their budget in January, the majority of them. So our near neighbours, Hammersmith and Fulham, Camden, Bromley, Islington, Brent and Wandsworth have all announced a similar increase. Westminster have yet to announce what they're doing. So we know this is a difficult part of the budget, but we think it's absolutely fundamental to maintaining a balanced budget and doing all that we need to do to maintain our housing for our residents. So anything else you want to ask us as well, please do ask us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Greg?
Thanks very much, Chair. I've got 3 areas of questioning, but I'll deal with them separately. And well, firstly, well done on getting to this stage of considering where you were in November and the options you were thinking about. It was a big challenge I know you were faced with. And the lead member rightly talked about the ambitious aspirations that we've got in terms of the upgrade and maintenance of the estate and the enormous backlog left by the TMO and the new regulatory regime and the inevitably expensive net zero objectives. But we did have that large funding gap to close when we looked at this in November, and you've come out with a balance today. So we talked about a few options as to how you might achieve that in principle, and just wondering how you got on with that, which techniques you used, and as a side to that, is the business plan that you're proposing to develop in the next year, is that sort of a more detailed look at that, or have I got that wrong? And thirdly, on this subject, at paragraph 8.4, you turn back to the disposal of non-estate assets, which is something we talked about in the autumn. Is that one subject to further work, such as a key decision, or and what timeline are you working on with that? And I'll leave the other questions to you. Chewed over that one.
Thank you. I'll leave Doug to answer the majority of those. And about the governance, though, about the key decision on the disposal ones as well. Probably Dan.
So I might try and answer the last one and then ask Doug to come in on the other 2, if that's all right, about the way that we talked about the options. But I think I'm right in saying that the report's leadership team agrees the principle of the disposals, and then it kind of delegates the individual decisions about the disposals to me in consultation with Councillor McVeigh, and obviously will inform ward councillors and so on as those disposals happen. But the idea is that that the leadership team decision, and of course then the full council decision that follows, is the agreement to that as an approach. So we wouldn't have a further headline key decision on that policy. The approval of this budget is the approval of that policy, if that makes sense. Doug, you were right to answer the stuff about the kind of process and the way that we consider the options.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that in our discussions with residents through a number of residents meetings and certainly through TCC is one of the things that residents were quite clear on is that they want improvements to be done. for us to do that, then we need to do everything we can to try and bridge that gap. So we started by looking at the actual work that was scheduled, and then we linked that to our repairs history and what we were actually spending currently. And so some things were then prioritised further up the capital programme, but there were other things that you can delay. So that isn't to say we won't do it. In fact, we will. It's just that it's not urgent to do now. And if it's not urgent to do now, why would we prioritise borrowing additional resources to do that? So by recasting our capital budget, we have moved some things forward, such as and agreed to do, such as kitchens and bathrooms, where we know that will be properties that fall out of decent homes, but other things which we know are not costing revenue money at the moment to move back. And we will strengthen that through this year, through the stock condition survey that we have to do. Whether we get the results of that stock condition survey in time for this time next year is debatable, because we have to get into every property under the new regulations, or likely to. The new regulations will be finally announced in February, but that's the indication that we've got. But so that will give you some of that gap. But there are also, though, as you will see, the policy for disposals, which we talked about earlier, where we do get properties which are are reasonably expensive for us to maintain, and are not perhaps linked to a wider estate. We would be seeking to dispose of those and then reinvesting that on estates that we already manage. There will be a capital gain from that, but also longer term it will reduce our operating costs and make it more effective. And that also is factored into bridging that gap. We feel that because we've managed our account up to the point we have now, that the level of borrowing also that we require is slightly different to what we anticipated in November. So in essence, any surplus made in the housing revenue account and depreciation goes into funding our capital. This is where I'll start looking at finance people to tell me how that's worked out. And so we feel that we are able to set a balanced budget for the next 5 years based on this policy that we have here. Some of this is predicated also by the fact that we put the rent up by 7.7%, which we know is not something we wish to be doing. Absolutely we don't, but we also want to make sure that we are delivering those improvements that people want. So that's what we've looked at in terms of that. I don't know if there's anything else you wish to add, Archer, in terms of bridging that gap.
Thanks, Doug. In addition to that, the government has extended the discounted borrowing rate, so we've had the benefit of that, while previous business plan did not assume that. So that's been a positive as well for the business plan.
I have 2 other lines of question, but maybe somebody else wants to have a go at them.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, can I just, following on directly from what you're asking, as I remember the last meeting, there was a gap of about £200 million. So if you could kind of explain how, I mean, well done for making that up, but could you say how much the 7.7 raise in rents will be, and where the extra money comes from? Because, you know, selling off properties, that's not actually a done deal yet. So, yeah, if you could explain where the rest of the 200 million is going to come from, apart from, and how much the rent increase will raise. Thank you.
So each percent roughly raises about £500,000. So 7% will raise you 3.5, so it'll be about 3.8 in total. But that recurs throughout your business plan. So in your factoring, you get 3.8. And you get that next year and the year after, so it raises a substantial amount of money. I don't know if you wish to add anything in terms of how the gap itself has been bridged, because if we are spreading our capital programme out over a slightly longer period, that 200 million also then reduces, plus the rent increase, plus the 38 million from disposals. But it might be useful if we shared a table that might have said where the 200 million was, because that was indeed the gap, what the gap is now, and how that's being funded over the next 5 years. So yes, we've benefited from interest rates. So ultimately, there's a converse beneficiary from interest rates in terms of having money in the account, which then has paid interest.
So the second of my lines of questioning was the new homes programme, which is dealt with at paragraph 14 for the most part. But the thing I want to ask about here is looking deeper into the future, that we could also expect a fairly significant uplift in our estate through the two opportunities areas at Kensal and Earls Court, which are in the under planning application or close to planning application. And so I'm just wondering how you're getting on with modelling the financial aspects of that in the housing department, or is it really too early?
So I can try and answer that. So at the moment, I think I'm right in saying, I'm going to check that are true, that we've not assumed in the current modelling that the council will acquire any of the homes on those schemes. So the default position, as you can imagine with any development, is that the private developer would sell those homes on to a housing association. We have expressed interest to both the developers at Kensal Canal Side and Earls Court of exploring the possibility of the council acquiring some or all of the social rent on those schemes, and but of course those negotiations would be on the basis of a kind of a capital outlay. I mean, it would be not as it were a market price for that housing. It would be a capital outlay that corresponded to the fact that they were designated as social housing. But nevertheless, you'd be taking debt onto the HRA and then, as it were, paying it off using the rental income that you then got. If and when we
ourselves on our own land, which, as you can imagine, in Kensington and Chelsea is absolutely vanishingly small land that the council owns, and so as a result our programmes had to be in kind of very small infill sites. You don't get any economy of scale. It's been very challenging, actually, to be honest. And as you say, both Earls Court and Kensal are actually developers' land. We don't own it, but I think it's really important to look at how we deliver housing in the round, including on all our private developments, and how we work with them, how we work with our registered providers. We're still in negotiation, I think, with a big development down that's already been more or less completed down in Chelsea. We know what's going to happen to the social homes there. How's that working? So thank you for bringing that, because I think it pulls it all into the bigger picture, which we're trying to really look at.
Thanks. My final question, I mean, if I had an hour, I'd go into detail on Appendix A, but I don't, so I'm going to skip that and go to Appendix B, which just something that struck me. It's the annual reminder that we have estates in Southall, all the way over in the west, which always amazes me when I see it, and because it's got the garages there. And as the lead member will know, I recently saw a list of shame of local authorities' garage occupancy. While ours wasn't anywhere near the top of the list, it still had a 23% unoccupied rate on the garages that we own, which doesn't appear to be the best use of the assets. You might not be able to answer that question now because it isn't in the budget, but if you can, perhaps you could account for the occupancy of the budget here or in a written answer later on.
Yes, I mean, Doug knows chapter and verse about the garages because we've had lots of conversations about it, but also, which I learnt the other day from our lead member in planning and place, he says often quite a few of the new cars are too big to fit into our smaller garages, which I thought was quite interesting. But over to Doug on the finances.
So we have a number of garages which are in quite undesirable areas where there isn't a significant amount of security and they're underground, which presents letting them reasonably problematic. We've got a policy on parking which is linked to, I mean, you can see it because it'll be going up, is linked to certain areas of the borough, but it's quite rigid. And I think one of the discussions that we are going to have with residents over this year is about changing that to make it a little bit more bespoke and suitable to the estates that it's located on. We also don't have a green parking policy within housing, so we would like to amend that. And we think, therefore, we can tailor what we charge for garages to the local market around there, and maybe be able to let garages at rates which people will pay. There are also, though, elements of security that we've done at some of our garage areas that we're also working on in others to ensure that we can boost that. And then there are other areas that we're looking at to perhaps where there isn't demand to dispose for other uses, such as commercial uses, where we already have a number of our garages being rented out on a commercial basis. So there is an overall view on each of each garage areas, because you're quite right, if it's empty, it's an asset that's not earning anything for the housing revenue account and is there to be maintained still.
Thanks very much. I mean, that all makes sense. The premise of this article was, I think, based on above-ground garages that with doors and sort of big parking areas that I think the author would have said pull them down and replace them with housing. But I think a lot of what I inferred from your answer is that these are underground, like Elm Park Gardens, where you're clearly not going to turn them into housing because they're 2 floors down under the building.
Lowerwood Court, Homefield, they all fit into the same category.
Very good. Thank you very much. That's me, Chair.
Thank you. Marie-Therese, do you have any further questions?
Not a question, but just to say that in terms of selling properties on that are not in estates, I think it is a good idea to do that. I think there will always be some that will need to be retained for exceptional cases of difficulty or whatever, but I think in general we have a lot of, I mean, certainly in my ward we've got social housing dotted about, and you know that they could easily be sold on, and you know the money can therefore, you know, you could probably house more people if you sold the more expensive properties that we must have probably acquired a long time ago. So there we are.
We're not looking for this policy to be an indefinite policy either. I think that's a really important point. This is to plug the gap within the capital work. So if that gap disappears, then we may wish to review that, because at the moment, and the reason it's been brought in is to plug that gap. So I just wanted people to realise, you know, whatever we agree, the devil will be detailing that, and as we heard earlier, it will be subject to ratification. But it isn't going to be an indefinite thing. It's to plug the gap.
Just to reinforce what you said, Councillor, on the you know, each one will be a decision made on its own merits. So that although we're agreeing a blanket policy here, there may well be something. You know, for example, if there's a home which has a number of bedrooms or particular accessibility features which meets a particular need that it would be very hard to meet otherwise, then it would be silly to get rid of that one, and we wouldn't pursue it, if you see what I mean. But so one needs to apply judgment in each case. But this is kind of opening up the door in principle, if that makes sense.
Councillor Lane?
Thank you, Chair. I have a couple of lines of questioning. Perhaps I'll start with a couple, and then depending on where we get to with time, we can either move on or carry on. My first question, it relates to the CPI +1 model, and specifically paragraph 5.12. You talk in that paragraph about how the model doesn't entirely mitigate other risks which are present in the current economic climate. What are those risks? How likely are they to occur? And what's the plan to mitigate them if they do occur?
Shall I let Archer answer that one? With 5. What did you say? 5.1?
5.12. It's
5.12.
the final sentence in that paragraph. Sorry, probably went a bit quickly.
Thanks. And just to also put this in context is the year before they froze it, the CPI +1, which this is before my time, but the team were planning on having that in the budget, and then they didn't. So nothing ever seems to be completely set in stone. So that's why I think we had to allude to, you never know what might happen. But
absolutely. So rent policy has been changed twice in recent years. So we had a 4-year rent freeze where in fact rent went down, which is why lots of housing revenue accounts are in the same position, where people are recommending to put the rent up by 7.7% because it was unexpected and wasn't planned for when it was brought in. Similarly, last year that was not planned for either. So we don't know what the rent policy is going to be next year because that has not been decided yet, and so therefore that creates inherent risk in terms of not really knowing exactly what your income's going to be to properly business plan. But we are assuming that it's going to be at least inflation. That's what we've built into our plan. Others have been more optimistic in other boroughs, but here we're not sure, and we need to see what that is. But then, of course, interest rates and what might happen with interest rates is clearly another one of our bigger concerns. What we've noticed clearly is that global issues often have impacts here quite quickly, and there's lots of things that we thought were certain before that we've been proven haven't been. So interest rates going up to 5.25% was never initially on our business planning a few years back. In fact, it was, if we tried to suggest that, people have looked at us as though we lost our mind. So the fact that we're in this position just means that we are in an uncertain world.
Thank you.
And just to add a couple of other illustrations to that. So, and to your question about so yes, it really helps to be able to model on the assumption of CPI plus 1. What does that not mitigate against? Well, it doesn't mitigate against, for example, the fact that in some sectors, and I'm afraid just recently construction has been one of them, inflation runs significantly ahead of CPI, higher than CPI, which means that your income going up with CPI doesn't necessarily mean that your income is keeping pace with your costs. And so we have to, and then, this is just an example, but then to mitigate your question about how you'd mitigate that, we obviously need to be tracking that construction inflation really closely and scaling our investment program accordingly, so that we're not just assuming that our income will keep pace with our costs in terms of inflationary position. And then the other thing is that it's the way it's calculated is that it's measured on CPI in September in the year before the rent increase takes effect. So in a period when hopefully, touch wood, we are coming out of it now, but in a period where interest rates are fluctuating a lot, what happened in September doesn't necessarily help you in terms of trying to plan out what's going to happen in the following financial year. So again, you have to just be keeping a really close kind of real-time eye. And although we're setting the budget here based on our best expectation of how it's going to happen, that doesn't mean that Doug and Archer won't be in real time through the next financial year tracking what's happening in the construction market and making real-time adjustments to the budget to make sure that we bring it in.
Thank you. That's a big help. My second question relates to the HRA Tenant Support Fund, specifically paragraph 5.16 on the same page. I note that one of the objectives of the fund is to simplify the application process for those on income-based benefits, making it quicker and easier to receive help, of course, a good thing. Strikes me that mirrors a lot of what our voluntary sector does. I'm thinking specifically of groups like Citizens Advice. Could you just sort of speak perhaps briefly about how that intersects with what the voluntary sector does, and perhaps also assure us that work isn't duplicated there as well?
thank you, Will. Yes, and particularly as there is a new health fund coming to leadership team next week as well. So I'm very mindful that there could be a lot of duplication. But I've been reassured by officers that they really will be targeting people that they know on universal credit or on housing benefit. But I've also asked them to go that extra mile, because I'm really worried about those that don't get any help from the state, but are working incredibly hard, and this could just, this extra increase of £10 a week could really push them over the edge. So I would really like the messaging that go out that this is there and available for everybody who needs it. So So I don't know if Doug wants to talk a bit more about that, but that's definitely the message.
I'm happy to. This is very much targeted at our residents, and we do avail ourselves of support from the VCS sector on a lot of things, but their offer is across the borough. This is really around a tenancy sustainability agenda to make sure that people are able to remain in their properties, in their homes where they've lived, and we don't want this to unduly move people to a point where that becomes in jeopardy. So that's where it's aimed at. And what we realised last year, although we put the rent up below inflation, it still was quite an increase. It wasn't really the rent that was the issue. It was actually things like heating charges and service charges. Well, you've got to bear in mind that actually heating, the likelihood is, heating charges are going to come down and other areas of service charge. But when we were grappling with that, what we were able to do is help people over that sudden increase where you haven't budgeted for it. And it's really then dealing with people as individuals where you meet them and go through what their finances are, because all of a sudden if you've got a large increase and you haven't budgeted for, you need help to get over that till you can remodel your expenditure and outgoings. And that we work with people on a very individual basis, and it's about doing that so you can maintain your rent and then ensure that you ultimately you're able, paying your rent is clearly a key component to the tenancy agreement. So we've been quite successful in terms of that. So that's is slightly different to what we're doing with the VCS. It's very much landlord orientated, but focused very much on the individual.
That's very helpful to know. And perhaps just to sort of probe slightly further on that support fund, if I may, the key principles that are there under paragraph 5.16, my assumption is those are illustrative, but they're not a limited set of examples. So, for instance, under the fourth bullet point, you have, say, shopping, credit, rent accounts, but also perhaps things like childcare. I know is a very large expense for a lot of people. So can other things be included in those buckets as well?
Absolutely. What we want to make sure is that we give the support that enables people to remain in there. So it's about tenancy sustainability. So if there's an outgoing which is needs addressing, which is reasonable and people have been open with us, then that's what we would look to do.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And then I think my sort of final question for the time being relates to Appendix D, which is the equality impact assessment, and perhaps this is down to my misunderstanding, but I was just curious in relation to where the various groups with protected characteristics are assessed, so sort of page 33 onwards. The way they're assessed is by looking at the population across the whole borough, not those affected by the HRA or the rent increase. So I was just curious to understand how does that assessment help us if it's a picture of the entire borough? Would it not be more prudent to focus on assessing the protected characteristics of those affected by the rent increase?
Yes, I get the point that you are making, Councillor, and I will take that away, because we do have quite a lot of protected characteristic data. We don't have it all for our residents because it's up to them what they supply to us, but certainly on the key protected characteristics we've collected quite a lot through our visiting officers. So I think this might be something that when we didn't have so much data, but it's what we used. So I would take that back.
Thank you very much. No further questions, Chair, for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Lloyd, do you have any questions?
Just a couple of points, really. One of them is a praise, but I'll save the praise till afterwards. I want to focus a bit more on the most vulnerable, and I know we've probed you a lot on that tonight, and I completely get whether it be a private apartment, share freehold, registered provider as the landlord, or the Royal Borough as the landlord, and the pressures you've got with the net zero commitment that we have, the improvements that we want to do, the new fire and safety regulations, as well as the borrowing constructions that you got there. But there are going to be people, I've spoken to them in my own ward, some of them call themselves jams, just about managing, some of them are on fixed incomes, some of them are retired, they moved into their flat, some of them bought their leasehold and have got service charges that are going through the roof in some cases. Can you focus on how, I get the universal credit people will be somewhat protected. Practically, how is it going to work if you're someone listening in tonight and you are panicking at these increases, and that's before we even know what the council is going to put the council tax up at, if at all. So how do they actually do this? Do you approach them, or do they have to approach you? How does that work?
So I think one of the things we learned from last year is that we needed to publicise this a lot more, and that's what we will be doing this year, so that people know, come and see us basically, come and see your housing officer, and we will be there to help and support you. Previously we waited, it was, well, you found yourself in debt, we can then help you. That's not the right way. So we will be sent, if this is approved, then we will be then writing out to all our residents, suggesting that, and then maybe doing a small campaign to advise people that this is available.
And again, Lloyd, if you know specific people in your ward, please, bring them to us, let them speak with Doug and his team specifically, because this is something that took us a long time to discuss, this increase, because I was very, very concerned about this. And with my background being in the lead member for communities, exactly, I know how many people use citizens' advice and everything, and so it was, it's been a very difficult decision to make. But so this is why we're trying to really do a bit more of a kind of a wraparound care for that, and let people maintain their dignity when they need to ask for something as well, which is really important.
Yes, and I presume this will come in the form of a letter directly to tenants, and you may obviously identify who those people are already, but also if there was a general leaflet that could be put on notice boards as well, and residents groups, I'm sure, would happy to distribute those, because often the residents groups will know those people more than the landlord would. And then I'm going to come on to the praise bit, because under the new homes policy, some of us this week have seen some of those new homes, and I personally have been overwhelmed, and they exceeded my expectation, and I think we should be very proud of those new homes that we are delivering, and some of them quite soon to come online. I just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is really appreciated. I'll make sure all the team in the new homes under Dan and everyone gets that message, because I agree. I mean, Hewer Street, I think you went to, the quality is extraordinary. All that recycled old brick, and it's beautiful. Yep, and it backs onto the school. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
Councillor Issay.
Thank you, Chair. It is the same question as Lloyd has raised, rent increase. And there are people, here it shows people who get benefits or universal credit, the rent will be covered. But people who are working and they are low wages, universal credit is not covering much, because I have seen people, they said you have to work that limit of hours. And some people, especially women, single mothers, they don't get, and that hours to get work. They go to work for carer, elderly people and this, but still the hours are limited. If the rent is increased and these people, they cannot afford, are you going to evict them? What is the policy? Because they are low income, still they work but low wages, and they cannot afford, and the universal credit is not covering everything nowadays. They make condition. Thank you.
So our intention isn't to evict anyone. Our intention is to keep people in their properties. What I would say is we will target our communications to those, because people who are on low wages tend to receive universal credit of some sort, or and we know well there's it's tapered up, isn't it? So if you're on a very low wage, then you will usually get a top-up support, and in which case we can target those people specifically, and we have done, because of course we know which people we've helped this year, and we will continue to prioritise those people to make sure that happens. I think the issue that you quite rightly flag is that there are people, just above that are equally in difficulty, and that's more the point also that Councillor North suggested, and I think for us that will become in advertising that there is an offer. Of course, it is about how you prioritise. There will be people who will not prioritise their rent, as in all sorts of sorry, that's just life sometimes. So, and we will offer them as much support. But if people do. This isn't a view that you can't pay your rent. You do need to pay your rent, but we will work with people to make sure that we don't have to take the action. But if you don't want to pay your rent, then there will sadly always be a consequence for our residents if they deliberately didn't wish to pay their rent. We're here to support them, and if residents engage with us, they will get that support. But it's a two-way process. That's what I'm trying to say.
Thank you. We also have some questions from Councillor Gardner, who has sent her apologies, and if I may just ask those on her behalf. Could the officers explain what a formula rent means and why we are choosing now to adopt it for new tenants, and who classifies as a new tenant?
So, formula rent is, I'm not 100% sure, but I've been told so it's a level of rent that was it goes back sort of 20 years, does it not, in terms of, so I'm now being asked an accounting question. I've got two people from finance diverted it to me. But it was about, depending on what area it all goes back to something like beacon values, and then what area you were at, what area you were in, and what the valuation was, would then set the level of rent that was what was a target rent for the authority or for that area that you would be moving your rent increase up towards. Is that something like that?
Yes, that's correct. It's based on the valuation.
Right, so I'm getting a technical question. But we've had that for new tenants for some time, I thought.
Yes.
So this isn't new to bring in. It's it's not you that's asked the question, Councillor Gardner. So this isn't new. This is something we've had for some while. So that enables us, when that came in, to charge slightly higher rents for new tenants, and it isn't when you transfer, I don't believe. I think it's for new tenants into this sector. Is that?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, I think it is. It's referred to on page 6, 5.3. Social rents are calculated in accordance with an agreed formula prescribed in the rent standard. The formula rent considers factors such as national average, the relative local earnings, number of bedrooms, and the relative property value. And I think that it would be really helpful as a committee if we could actually have a little bit more detail on what that is, if we could request that. If I can continue with Joanna's questions. What is the significance to the affordability of social housing for tenants by adopting the formula rent as set out in paragraph 5.6? Because it does say it allows flexibility to set rents for new tenants at up to 5% above formula rent. What is the significance to the affordability? If I can clarify a little bit more as well. So we've understood, and you've given us the actual figures in the table of the impact of 7.7% increase weekly to the average rent. We don't have those figures when we're talking about formula rent.
I'm glad actually you're all asking these questions, because when I saw the paper in the early days of January, I was also had a lot of questions about formula rent, and actually thought I didn't feel it should sit where it should sit in the paper, because I felt it wasn't so impactful on the budget as it sits in number 5 rather than kind of number 16. So I think we'll definitely take that away and come back with more information for you about all that and the impact it has, because as a percentage of new rental and tenancy contracts, it's so much smaller than obviously the complete coverage of the 7.7%.
So in order for you to know that we have a balanced budget here, there must have been some modelling of the number of formula rents that there might be, that there already are, and where those figures are coming from. So it would be really helpful, I think, for all of us to see a little bit more detail on that.
We can answer that, Chair,
yes, sorry.
if that's okay, because of course this applies to new tenants, so we let about 200 properties a year, and it would have factored into the modelling.
It's built into the model, and it's part of the average weekly rent for each of the bedrooms, so that's built in. In terms of what that means on top of the 7.5%, it's an additional 0.5% on top of that if you're reletting. Your flexible amount that you can add on.
So that would mean that some people would have a 12% increase. 5 on top of 7.7.
So on top of your average, if you're inflating that by 7.7, you have the flexibility within a capped amount to inflate that with an additional 5%.
7.7 plus 5 equals 12.7?
But it's not a not a rent increase. It's the new rent when you let the property. Yeah. So I appreciate the semantics.
Yeah,
there.
thank you. Thank you for that one. I have a couple of questions myself I'd like to ask, and if anyone else has forgotten something they'd like to ask, do please let me know. On the subject of the consulting with the TCC on the rent increases, was that a formal consultation, and do you have a set number of responses, or was it more gauging the feeling?
You were there, Chair, so absolutely was gauging the feeling for what people said and how the room reacted to certain issues. And in fact, you at TCC, the debate was about the rent increase, but soon moved very quickly to how we were going to the capital works that needed to be done on various properties, which became a much more primary discussion than actually the rent increase, which is what we were there to present.
Thank you. And that takes me on to the question of, and I think we've sort of already touched on it a little bit, for a given individual resident, we have the 7.7% increase to the rent. We also have, I think, 6.7, looking at Appendix A, I think it's 6.7 to the service charge. I think in the case of the Traveller site, it's 7.7 and 7.7. And then we have, for leaseholders, again, the 6.7 on the service charge and 10% on the insurance. I'm looking at Appendix A on page 25. And I just wish to express some concern, albeit we are looking at a tenant support fund and looking at ways to mitigate the impacts of this. It's not only a 7% on the rent, it's 6.7% on the service charge. Now, when we look at the beginning of the paper, I think it is 3.5 on page 4. A local housing authority may make such reasonable charges as they may determine. And I think that ties in again to, as you say, Doug, about the question of the major works and the repairs. Are we talking about a reasonable charge here relative to the state of repair and the disruption that residents are experiencing? Because I think as we've mentioned, some of the new homes are lovely and they won't be on a building site, whereas quite a lot of our residents are living with a lot of disruption and a lot of disrepair. And I think there may be questions about how reasonable that is, notwithstanding the need to have a balanced budget.
I might, if I may, I might start on that. And I mean, and this goes to the very crux of kind of perhaps where Councillor Hammond came in with his first question, which is about this. You know, we're striking a really difficult balance here between the need to invest in the stock, and of course, it's precisely because there's such a backlog of investment and a need to invest that so many of our residents, a disproportionately large number of our residents, probably compared to most other boroughs, are experiencing works at the moment because that's not been happening for so long. So it is in some ways a bit of a cruel irony that we're having to raise money to pay for that work at exactly the same time that the residents are experiencing the impact of it. But as Doug and others have said, the really clear feedback from the meetings we had with residents was that on balance, the thing they prioritised most of all was the improvement to their homes, and that they recognised that it was a difficult trade-off, and it's not a nice trade-off for any of us to be having to make, but that they were prepared to accept these increases overall and prepared to accept the disruption because they'd been waiting for so long for improvements to their home, which they had a right to expect. So you're quite right to highlight the kind of challenges that are inherent in that trade-off, and it's not one that we make kind of flippantly or without thought. But our judgment, informed very closely by the feedback from residents, was that this is the way, in our particular circumstance, to strike that balance. That doesn't mean, of course, that we shouldn't be doing everything we can, as we've talked about, both to alleviate the impact of the rising costs for those residents who it hits hardest, and also to reduce where we can the impact of the works and to manage them in the most sensitive and careful way we possibly can. But you've cut right to the heart of the difficult judgment that we're trying to make and that we're presenting to you. And if you feel we've struck it wrong, then obviously we're really interested to hear that feedback.
Thank you.
Just on a tiny positive anecdote, I was speaking to a resident at a residents' meeting on Tuesday night. Actually, she was a resident from a different estate. I was on Silchester Estate, but she was from a different estate. And she was saying she's just had her new windows put in and she hasn't had to put the heating on. And she says it's incredible, the change. So I know it's a long process and the disruption is difficult. No one likes building works. But if at the end of the day you're getting something out of it, which will make a significant difference, particularly I'm obsessed about proper windows. I think that's the one thing we really need to be able to do. So anyway, she was happy.
Thank you. And I think it's really important to keep in mind and stay focused if we can on those small bits of positivity that are coming out of this. But I really do want to strike a note of caution on any overall conclusion or implication that we have residents' consent for this. Because, as you've said, Doug, I was there, and while there wasn't a massive outcry, I'm not sure that we can take that as necessarily a consent, and that agenda did have other items on it which may have felt more immediate to the residents. So I think we shouldn't say that we have sort of consent and agreement with residents for this, and we won't know, I think, until it actually happens and residents can feel it.
Chair, I agree.
We won't know how that's going to land. And I think that takes me on, if I may, to my next point, which is about the Tenant Support Fund. So we are focusing on the most vulnerable, and I am a little confused myself as to who do we mean by that, because we've mentioned residents who are in receipt of, say, universal credit or housing benefit, and I think the figure in the paper across the borough is 65%, which leaves 35% not. And as Councillor North has mentioned, and also Councillor Issay, there will be people who may be on a low income relatively compared to this rent, for whom it's going to be very difficult. So when we talk about the most vulnerable, are we talking about the people who are in receipt of these the state support, or people who are not?
So we have, out of that 65%, about 40% have their rent fully covered. About 25% might have this slightly wrong, but that's my recollection, have their rent partially covered in terms of what they get paid. So we know the income of those people because they are working, but they are on lower wages. The problem we have with people who are not claiming anything is we don't know what their income is. That's why we need to advertise this a lot wider, so that if people are feeling there are problems, that they're struggling to sustain their tenancy, that we are there as a helping hand. But we don't know, we might have people that, for sake of argument, are just above that, and we might have people who are a long way above that, but we don't know because their income is a private matter between themselves. If they're paying the rent, then that's the contract we have with them, not knowing exactly what they earn. But we will target people we know that are paying full rent, maybe in a slightly different way. So one of the things that will come out of this, should be approved, is a proper communication strategy that deals with all the groups that we manage, because this is important. Even people on full housing benefit clearly are struggling, especially that's what we found last year when the heating charges went up significantly. That's where most of our tenant support fund was aimed at, because their budget and ability to move to accommodate that was compromised. So we do need a proper strategy that covers each area. But I've heard this from three of you, and this is certainly something we would take away.
Thank you. And will it be accessible to the travellers' side?
Yes.
Thank you. That was a short one. And also, do we think that the £500,000 is going to be enough? Is that based on some projection?
So we haven't we haven't quite spent the full amount this year, but we're going to get reasonably close to it, we believe. Bearing this is a further extension, this was, and given what we know about people who are on low wages, this is our best estimate. We don't know is the full answer. I feel, provided it's, we will know pretty soon after we've advertised whether we've got enough, and it might be something that we need to come back to during the year.
Thank you. And will the support that's given in that, will that be a one-off piece of support, or will that be ongoing? Because this rent is going to be relentless every single week.
So that's what I meant about working with residents in terms of their budgeting and in terms of what we can do to budget in a way which is going to be able to secure a longer term future. So it is about tiding people over for a set period until they're able to. So there are other things this links to, such as employment support and so on and so forth, that we can work with. But it's about working with the tenant to get yourself to a more sustainable period longer term.
Thank you. I'm afraid I've just got two more, if I could just go quickly. I just want to strike a note of caution on the selling and re-providing of street properties or non-estate properties. Councillor McVeigh, you said at the beginning of the meeting that in our borough, land is vanishingly scarce and we have no economy of scale on buildings. So when we're talking about re-provision, it's not going to be possible, I don't think, to be building more estates.
Correct. The re-provision will probably happen by buying on estates.
Right.
And so again, as Doug mentioned earlier, the maintenance cost of keeping a single kind of standalone house anywhere in the borough, irrespective of postcode, is much more than if you're a flat within a unit. So that's the rationale behind
buying
that.
on estate. Thank you for that. And finally, I think section 10 on the housing strategy. I just feel I've noticed a little bit of an omission here in terms of 10.2, the 6 key priorities. So the first bullet point we have, quite rightly so, is supporting Grenfell survivors and bereaved. I'm actually not seeing anything there about supporting the rest of the Grenfell community. and I would like to suggest that that be inserted.
Yes, so those are the priorities from the existing kind of expiring strategy.
Yep.
So we can absolutely take that feedback on board in the way that we articulate our commitments in the new one.
Yes, I mean, I think it's disappointing that existing strategy, and presumably for the last 6.5 years, a large number of people affected by Grenfell have not even been included. So I would really like to see that in the new strategy going forwards.
That is very, very well put. Thank you, Chair. And as you know, we do it within our housing team. You know the huge amount of work on LankWest. You were at the LankWest board last week. I think there's been meetings every night for the last few weeks. We do it, but you're right, we haven't articulated. It is obviously one of our priorities. But thank you for saying that.
Thank you. And we need to also recall and remember that although Lancaster West is the closest and the biggest, those affected by Grenfell do extend beyond that. And sadly, for 6 years, that hasn't really been satisfactorily acknowledged by the council, I don't think. Now, I've been asked, do we think that will be a recommendation? As a committee, are we happy with that?
I think that would be a good idea, actually.
I'm happy, very happy, I think.
Yes.
That's the majority, so yes.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any other suggestions for any recommendations we would like to make as a committee?
Can I?
Yes.
Quick question. How much is service charge a week, a month, a year? Just average, just as a ballpark.
£13.
How much?
13. Saw it earlier. Saw it earlier. It's in the paper, I think.
13 per week. That doesn't make sense.
Average weekly.
So that's the average for, so in essence, it depends on the services you're getting.
Yeah.
So on some estates you will receive a number of services, on other properties you will maybe receive fewer. So on average it's £13 per week.
13, that is actually, I think, quite low. I mean, if you've got lifts and things, everything, gets more expensive, doesn't it? But £13 a week is, okay. That's with the raise, all.
That doesn't, so that is service charges.
Yeah.
So that will pay for your grounds maintenance, your caretaking, your cleaning, your lighting, that sort of stuff.
And that is with the increase or before the increase?
That's current.
Current. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Issay.
Thank you, Chair. Page 16, 9.22, social housing regulations. The council several times said, housing providers, they are independent for their services. And here, you mentioned about the Regulation Act. And it says, every landlord will need to comply with it. So if the social housing, the landlords, they don't comply to address mold or dam or leak or anything, what measures the council is planning to take?
So I think I'm bringing a paper on the 21st of March to the one after next week.
Yes.
Specifically on this because we know reasonably certainly, I suppose, in terms of there's consultation gone out from the regulator about how it's all going to operate, but they haven't finalised it. They haven't come back and said this is the final thing. That's due next month, which is why we're bringing it in March, because we could say what's expected. So if the council or a registered provider does not comply with that, then there is a paper where they've just recently consulted on the powers by which they can enforce, and within that consultation was some quite serious powers in terms of taking on the management, fines, coming in and doing the work in default. There's quite a lot of things within that. We will bring that detail on the 21st of March, because I'm expecting by that time we've got it finalised from the regulator. What we should be clear about is that regulation regime at the moment it goes live on the 1st of April, which isn't very far away. So we're spending quite a bit of time planning for it, but the actual finalisation of things will happen next month. Well, not next month, we're in February today, aren't we? So this month.
And also in addition to that, because it is so fundamental, like I mentioned in my introduction, the two new acts, the Fire Safety Act and the Building Act, we are putting together a briefing, a full training session for councillors, and we're going to offer it on several dates because I'd really almost like it to be mandatory because I think it's so important and it's so impactful for our borough. I've been to a couple of training sessions we had an outside, very well-respected man coming in and telling us a lot about it, and the powers the Ombudsman have seem pretty intense, and the housing regulator as well. So I think, to your question, specifically, it will be to other registered providers as well, that they will have to answer to them.
But just to add to that, to be really clear, the powers to intervene for a landlord other than the council, a housing association registered provider, the council doesn't get any new powers to enforce the rules. It's the social housing regulator that steps in and enforces the rules. So we have now and will continue to have a limited set of powers in the kind of environmental health field to enforce various quality issues, both in private rented housing and in social rented housing from housing associations. But all of these new powers that Doug's described, including the power to step in and take over the operation, that's not a power for the council to step in with a housing association. It's a power for the national social housing regulator to step in. So we won't have any new enforcement powers, any new enforcement responsibilities arising from that. That's not the relationship we have with housing associations anymore.
Chair, and Doc, you mentioned about the consultation. Is this consultation also was sent to the tenants of social housing who always face the problem? That is one question. And the other one is, for example, if the landlords of housing associations, they don't comply with this regulation, is there a help desk the council create for the tenants so they can contact you or inform, or any way they can complain? Because before social housing, they have their own regulations. So now, since thanks to God, this regulation act is coming up, how can the tenants communicate with the council? Thank you so much.
So there's a couple of points in there. So the consultation that the regulator, so this is the regulator's new powers. So the regulator has consulted in terms of a sort of national tenants body, which is also part of what's set up there. So they've been out and spoken to I don't know. I don't know the exact figures. It's quite a big figure. I think it's like 1,600 rings a bell, but I might be wrong. But they've been out speaking to lots and lots of residents in terms of what they're not happy with, which has formulated this act. So whilst they haven't specifically, we've written to every resident in RBKC, I would be surprised if there's been no residents in RBKC who haven't contributed into that. But then for registered providers and the tenants of registered providers, the access way really is through either going to the regulator themselves direct, and some do, and indeed some council tenants do, because that's the regulator for our industry, if you like. So that's what the housing regulator is there for. Alternatively, they can go through the housing ombudsman, who will also then investigate that. But the housing ombudsman will let the regulator know the level of complaints and the issues that have arisen. So, and that's actually been mandated now. So that's the process that's going to be in place. I might have got something wrong about the national conversation they had, but they definitely went around the country speaking to people.
Thank you. Councillor McVeigh, did you want to say something?
No, but I'm looking forward to sharing all our knowledge about this with fellow councillors, because it is an extraordinarily detailed new regulation coming through. So,
Thank you.
Just as an add-on, as a separate hat, I represent a group of mansion blocks, private, they are going through exactly the same problem. Anybody that lives in a block of flats or shared occupation is going through huge cost increases. In fact, this very last month, we met with Lee Rowley, the housing minister. So there is a lot of conversations going on within, because there is a lot of blocks of flats in this part of London, and anybody that lives in a flat, you know, your front door for your flat, you are going to be responsible for. So we're putting this context. You are not the only landlord dealing with this type of problem. This is, and that's not even thinking about the net zero, because private blocks haven't got the same commitment to net zero.
Thank you, Councillor North. I have just one final question which I had omitted to ask previously, which is about section 1.3. So this account will be reviewed at the TCC. 13.3, strategic updates on the financial position of the Housing Management Service against its target. And this will also be presented to elected members on the Council's Housing and Communities Select Committee. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that when it will come to scrutiny. And in what form? So you can come back to us on that.
Yeah, well, perhaps that's part of the plan, that we sit down and work out with the officers at the same time we're working out the cycle for the budget next year.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I think in that case, we're coming to the end of the meeting. We've had, I think, a very fruitful and helpful discussion. We've heard about closing the funding gap. We've heard about the Tenant Support Fund. We've heard about vulnerable residents and those not in receipt of state support. And I think, I wonder if we all agree that we would like to make a comment that we are concerned about those residents, and we are concerned that the Tenant Support Fund is going to be adequate and sufficient to support those residents who need it. Would we agree with that? We feel, yeah.
Finesse the wording, but yes.
Yes, finesse the wording. So we've heard also about the selling of the street properties, and thank you for the clarity on that. And we also have a request to hear more about the formula rent, so that's been noted, I think. That being said, I think we are now at the end of the meeting, and thank you very much to everybody for coming.